This is Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. It is July 11th, and today I'd like to discuss something that I really delved into during the writing of The Last Ships from Hamburg, and this is the analysis of how there were actually two pools of capital that were financing America's explosive Gilded Age expansion between 1865 and 1914. And in many ways, the conflict that America ended up joining in 1917, the First World War, was as much a battle of sources of capital as it was about nationalistic expansion and ambitions. During the Gilded Age, America, in spite of all of its wealth, was at its essence a debtor nation versus a creditor nation. That is, European countries, European powers, such as Great Britain, France, and the newly unified Germany, were providing vast sums of investment capital to fund America's railroads, America's mining enterprises, and you had a number of Americans who got rich basically making European investors rich. And by the 1880s and 1890s, it was clear that there were two sources of capital that American businesses were fighting for. And the first came from England and France. And this source of capital was the House of Morgan, J.S. Morgan in London, founded by Junius Spencer Morgan. And this investment house was eventually taken over by his son, John Pierpont Morgan, who founded J.P. Morgan and Company in New York and was also a partner of the Philadelphia investment bank Drexel Morgan, which was founded as a joint venture with Anthony Drexel. Anthony Drexel in Philadelphia had made his first fortune as an underwriter of U.S. bonds during the Civil War, and Anthony Drexel was mentor to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was a rather brilliant but erratic student, and Junius Spencer Morgan, his father, basically told Tony Drexel, as he was known, to take his young son under his wing and teach him the basics of finance. And J.P. Morgan himself was extraordinarily disciplined when it came to mathematical analysis, and he learned the art of diplomatic banking from Tony Drexel. Tony Drexel himself was the son of an Austrian immigrant who had come to America as a portrait painter and discovered that he was a much better banker than he was a portrait painter. And this built the Drexel family firm, Drexel and Company, and later this became part of the Morgan Empire. So J.P. Morgan's sources of capital was primarily from England, but also from France. And the British banking house of Baring Brothers and Company was the frequent partner for J.P. Morgan's ventures. And it was through the House of Barings that so much capital for J.P. Morgan's railroads and his trusts, such as International Harvester and U.S. Steel, that's what helped turn J.P. Morgan into a leading investment banker. And Barings and Brothers and Company was in many ways the investment banker for the British Empire. But then you had a second pool of capital that competed with Barings and J.P. Morgan, and this was from the newly emergent and newly unified Germany, which came into being in 1871. And the force behind this source of capital was the House of Rothschild, which was founded in the 18th century by Meyer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt, Germany. And Meyer Amschel Rothschild, as well detailed by historians such as Niall Ferguson, sent his sons to various European capitals to start banks and arms of the House of Rothschild. The Rothschild Bank made its first gigantic fortune underwriting Napoleon's wars. And in the mid-19th century, it decided to branch out into America. And to do so, the Rothschilds sent out a promising young protege named August Schoenberg, who was from Cologne. He was also, like the Rothschilds, a German Jew. The Rothschilds were very careful about who they selected. If they did not select family, they selected close cousins or other closely intertwined Jewish family members to serve as their emissaries. And August Schoenberg seemed to be the right choice. Very smart, very cagey. He was sent to New York to be the agent of the House of Rothschilds and to basically scout out investment opportunities in America for this family. Now, August Schoenberg was something of a turncoat and a moonlighter in that he proved to be not as trustworthy as the Rothschild family had hoped. He eventually moonlighted and did business on his own, and eventually the Rothschilds fired him. August Schoenberg was undeterred by this. He picked up many clients of his own in railroads and oil and other new enterprises, and he changed his name from August Schoenberg to the much more, shall we say, Protestant-sounding August Belmont. That was the French translation of his name, Beautiful Mountain. He then married a non-Jew and basically assimilated into upper-class New York society. The Rothschilds never forgave him for this, but August Belmont soon became one of the wealthiest men in New York, and it was for him that the Belmont racetrack was named. His family, his sons also especially got involved in American horse racing. But the Rothschilds were undeterred by this betrayal, and they also worked closely with other German Jewish banks in the German states. Among them was the house of M.M. Warburg and Company, located in Hamburg. They were very much involved in underwriting shipping businesses in the port of Hamburg. And eventually, the house of M.M. Warburg, they, for a brief period, hired a young man named Jacob Schiff, who had grown up next door to the Rothschilds in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. And in the 1860s, Jacob Schiff was sent off as a teenager to basically make his own fortune. And it was ultimately he that became the representative of German capital in the United States. In 1863, he arrived in the United States with only $500 in his pocket, and he had traveled to America on a sailing ship, steadily working his way through a big package of dried kosher meat that his father insisted on giving to him. And Jacob had vowed to his father that he would maintain his faith in the native land. He would take a job with the investment bank of Kuhn Loeb and Company that was also founded by German Jewish immigrants. And he eventually married the leading partner's daughter. He married Solomon Loeb's daughter, Teresa, in the 1870s. And Jacob Schiff decided to deploy Kuhn Loeb's capital to underwrite American railroads himself. And his father-in-law thought it was not a very good idea. But the young, driven immigrant said, "Watch me, I'm going to hop on board the next great thing in technology, railroads." It was basically the internet of its time. And by the 1890s, Jacob Schiff had become investment banker to the Rockefellers, to the Union Pacific under E.H. Harriman, and also the Pennsylvania Railroad. So you had a lot of German money and also Austro-Hungarian money coming in to fund these enterprises. And this created a very famous divide on Wall Street during the Gilded Age that was known as the 5 o'clock rule, in which there were Jewish investment banks such as Kuhn Loeb and Company and Gentile investment banks such as J.P. Morgan and Company. And these two spheres would do deals together. They would work together as co-underwriters on these big deals. But after 5 o'clock, they did not socialize together. They did not join the same clubs. They did not generally live in the same neighborhoods. And this was something that was just accepted as a matter of fact. And starting in 1877, 1878, with the infamous Hilton-Seligman affair that was discussed on an earlier podcast, anti-Semitism within high New York society and East Coast society went from being something that was pretty much unsaid to something that was openly touted and accepted. Jacob Schiff basically accepted that he was happy to be the leader of America's Jewish community, but he was also sort of resigned to being number two next to J.P. Morgan. That was just how society worked, unfortunately. And he had no interest in joining elite Gentile society. His focus was on Jewish society, which was then known as Our Crowd, the elite and small group of German Jewish families in New York, who also had branches in cities like Philadelphia. The Guggenheims, by the way, who were part of that group. They had gotten their start in Philadelphia. They became owners of some of America's most profitable mining enterprises. J.P. Morgan himself had a very contentious relationship with Jacob Schiff, and the two of them had a grudging respect of each other. But these are the two pools of capital, of wealth creators in New York that funneled European wealth into American enterprises. And they also summered in different communities. J.P. Morgan's crowd summered in the Hudson River Valley in Newport, Rhode Island. Jacob Schiff's crowd would summer on the New Jersey shore, in places like Long Branch. So it was a business relationship. It was not a social relationship. But this defined the American financial community from the 1880s all the way up to the 1940s and the 1950s, when finally these two groups of bankers, the German Jews and the Protestant bankers, finally began intermarrying. And thus, this blurred the lines and eventually dissolved this division that lasted a very long time but had a tremendous impact on American finance and American social history. Thank you so much for listening to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa.